So thanks everyone for joining us in this session, and thanks to the organizers of ICLDC for the opportunity to participate in this conference. We're grateful to be able to join you from Treaty 4 territory in the homeland of the Métis Nation in southern Saskatchewan, Canada, as well as from the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation in eastern Ontario, Canada. In this presentation, we'll be discussing approaches to working with still image sources in language documentation and revitalization, and focusing in particular on a free cloud-based tool that we hope will be useful for improving the accessibility of language materials in these formats. Before we get too deep into our slides, we should acknowledge that this work has been taking place in collaboration with colleagues and friends at a number of different organizations and communities, including most prominently the Office of the Tsuut'ina Language Commissioner, which, under the leadership of Bruce Starlight, has been a driving force behind much of the language work discussed here. We're grateful to have the chance to work alongside our colleagues in each of these institutions, helping to explore some of the technologies and techniques we'll be talking about today. So what is this talk all about? It's essentially a talk about annotation practices in documentation and revitalization. And annotation has really been a central concept has defined much of the way we think about documentary linguistic practice today. This idea of adding interpretive information to primary records of language knowledge and use as one way of unlocking or enabling their further use and reuse down the road. Now, there's certainly many approaches to annotation within documentary linguistics, but it's often at least tacitly assumed that we focus initially or even primarily on transcribing audio or video materials. This is even the case in recent surveys of annotation practices in the field, which focus entirely and exclusively on audio and video recordings. And you don't have to look far to find examples like this. So in earlier definitional sources, writings by Nicholas Himmelman, he points out that transcription and annotation of recordings constitute the major workload in a documentation project. But we underscore that recordings here most likely refers to, at least assumedly refers to, audio and video materials, and not the kinds of materials we're talking about here today. So what then about cases where records of linguistic and cultural practices are found in still image sources instead? How are people treating that in terms of annotation? And we should mention that for many languages, these kinds of materials are actually quite important. There may be collections of handwritten field notes, or typed or printed materials, or historical manuscripts that can be quite valuable resources, maybe especially for many awakening and revitalizing languages, as we've seen from the successive models like the Breath of Life. And if we look around the world, we certainly find examples of this today. So the Living Archive of Aboriginal Languages has been gathering together books from languages and communities all throughout the Northern Territory and Australia, recognizing the importance of these sources for many Indigenous communities. Likewise, in the US, the Woyake Project from Standing Rock Sioux Nation has been using the tool that we'll be talking about in a few minutes for a number of years as part of a larger project to make historical Dakota and Lakota newspapers more available within their community. Likewise, if we look across the Atlantic to the Uralic languages, there's work happening right now to transcribe manuscript sources and marry them together with other forms of documentation to make those resources more accessible. So we're certainly not the only people talking about this. Now, what does work actually look like involving still image documentation today? In many cases, we note that people are still approaching these materials essentially with pen and paper. That is, individuals consult primary documentation and make their notes or extract their information, but don't necessarily enrich those resources in the process with new information. So it becomes no more easy for the next user to interpret or use than it was for the first, right? We see more promise, and I think this is a growing trend within documentation, of actually typing up the contents of those still image sources, but most often in the form of standalone documents, separate from the original materials themselves. So an individual accesses a still image documentary source and then types up parts of its contents in a spreadsheet or a Word document or a Google Doc. That's certainly not uncommon, but it comes with certain disadvantages as well. So in work that Nick Teberg had undertaken a number of years ago with the Daisy Bates vocabularies, he noted that individuals had transcribed parts of these materials in standalone documents, but those standalone documents hadn't actually led to a marked improvement in the accessibility of this collection. And he said that if instead those textual documents have been created as facsimiles of the originals, so that you could actually get back to the original sources, the entire collection would have been much more use, both to Indigenous people and to other researchers. And that's the case we're trying to make today. Really, the work that we're talking about this, excuse me, in this session is more about using specialized tools and standards that help keep document images and text more closely together. And we'll note that this is a larger trend within language documentation. Work by colleagues through the Miami, Illinois Digital Archive from IAMIA, applications of the TEI to WENDOT, and the Indigenous Languages Manuscript Interface is applied to Tunica, all represent part of this larger trend. So I think rethink annotation practices in documentary linguistics to include still image materials. And the work that we'll be talking about today tries to move that further on, in this case, using a new annotation platform called Transcribus.
So now that we've seen that there's this need for good still image documentation resources, we'd like to introduce a tool we personally have been using called Transcribus. Now, in the words of its creators, Transcribus is a comprehensive platform for the digitization, AI-powered text recognition, transcription, and searching of historical documents from any place, anytime, and in any language. Transcribus was developed by the University of Innsbruck in collaboration with several European research groups, and it's currently under the purview of the European Cooperative Society. Now, some features of Transcribus are that it's open source, cloud-based platform with multiple export options. It's language and script agnostic, meaning it can be used on syllabics, Roman, diacritics, etc. It's non-proprietary and it produces Unicode and XML-based transcripts, and it's collaborative, meaning multiple users can work on any page, document, or collection that they've been added to, both synchronously and asynchronously. And to give you a bit of an idea of the interface, the image on the right is a partial snapshot of Transcribus, showing a scanned page on top and the corresponding text transcription just below. And it's of note that this particular snapshot was taken from the P.E. Goddard Notebook Collection. So when using Transcribus, it's important to know what makes up a document. So starting with the first image on the left, in hierarchical order from largest to smallest, first we have pages. So pages are the scanned image that you provide to Transcribus. Within pages are text regions, which is the green box on that same image there. Text regions delineate where on the image the text is located. Then within text regions, we have lines, which is the first image on the right. Lines are shown in blue and highlight the general area of the current region being transcribed. And within lines are baselines, which are in gray with some small dots that you can hopefully see there. And baselines mark precisely where on the page a given line of text is. Now, of these four, pages, text regions, and lines function essentially as area markers, whereas baselines are integral content markers, which are needed to make use of some of Transcribus's additional features. So one of those additional features is handwritten text recognition. So Transcribus is able to train and apply handwritten text recognition models based on any set of transcribed and image-aligned pages. Importantly, HTR models in Transcribus are both language and script independent, meaning they can be used on any language and any handwriting because the text is generated based solely on the data provided and not through referencing any software internal dictionaries, word, or character lists, as is often done with other text recognition software, such as Adobe or Evernote, for example.
So with that understanding of what Transcribus is, how have we gotten to use it for language documentation and revitalization? So it's important to note that Transcribus was originally developed for work with historical documents, not necessarily language-focused resources specifically. So our approach means using the software in often unintended or non-standard ways in order to accomplish what we need. So conventions and practices have developed collaboratively over several months worth of work, and they've been continually subject to change in response to various needs and issues that arise, both in response to issues that crop up as we go through the pages, as well as we increase our familiarity with the tool itself. So because of that, collective agreement on standards and cooperating to resolve problems have been really key, especially because issues could potentially be resolved in more than one way. So how does one start using Transcribus? As a general overview, it can be narrowed down to 4 basic steps. So you start with importing your still image language materials, whether it's PDF or PNG or whatever it is that you have, into Transcribus. From there, you would start to apply the automatic layout analysis to produce rough text regions, lines, and baselines for the pages that you've uploaded. After that, you can start to review and correct your baselines, with the goal being to have the baselines hug the bottom of the characters as much as possible, and then editing the reading order to match how the lines would theoretically be read by a human. And then after that, you just go into transcribing your text or applying your handwritten text recognition. So as a general overview of how this approach would look, From here, you see some images from the One Spot Sapir notebooks. So you see the images before you with some lines, and once you add the baselines, then you can start correcting them to make them more closely hug the characters that you see. And then once you've gone through all that, you're able to make adjustments to the reading order. So you can see with the image that popped up there with the reading order showing how the software would read it and the order for that. And then you can edit that as needed. And then once we've finished with that work, then we can move on to just transcribing and tagging and going from there. And it's worth noting that if other less common features appear on the page, then the general process has been to just leave them untouched and then discuss them in our next team meeting so we can develop a convention on it together and do it the same way moving forward, regardless of who's actually encountering that particular issue. So here's an example of an issue, this case coming from the Pliny Earl Goddard notebook set. So as an example, we have text that's not horizontal. So it could be vertical or at an unusual angle or following an irregular path, all of which being examples we have seen. And the approach that we've decided on is just rotate the page view in Transcribus, which we are able to do, and then add the baseline markers as normal, albeit at an angle, and then edit into the reading order as we see appropriate. This example of an issue comes from the One Spot Sapir notebook collection, and this issue displays portions that were written by multiple authors. So you can see the red check marks and the addition of spleen, which were added not by the original author of this collection, and it could be difficult in some situations to mark what has or hasn't been uploaded by a given author. And Transcribus actually enables us to tag various portions of the line with tags that we as users have added or identified. So we're able to show that this section was done by a different author. And then as a third example for our various unusual issues that have come up, this one again comes from the One Spot Sapir collection. And we see that this text contains non-textual elements. So in this case, it's a musical score, but there have also been examples of illustrations that have come up in various of the notebooks that we have worked on. And Transcribus actually enables us to tag the corresponding region as a graphic or as music. So it's structural tagging within Transcribus. So then we just do that, and then the remaining text within the given region can be treated with the usual text regions, lines, and baselines after we've done that.
So these strange issues that we've just seen have all come out of long-term projects we've been doing in collaboration with the Office of the Tsuut'ina Language Commissioner that aim to improve the accessibility of several sets of important historical handwritten and typewritten resources for the Tsuut'ina language. These are namely the P.E. Goddard notebooks, the One Spot Sapir notebooks, and the One Spot Young notebooks. And our aim with these projects was to apply Transcribus and the tools and services that Transcribus offers us to make the contents of these materials more searchable, exportable, and more amenable to further review for work in the future. So one of the projects we want to talk about at greater length is the One Spot Sapir notebook project that we incorporated into Transcribus. So in this project, we developed an image-aligned digital transcript of the handwritten notebooks. These notebooks were done in a narrow phonetic transcription. They had complex layouts, a mix of Tsuut'ina and English text, had contributions from additional and multiple authors. And so they were a little tricky, kind of, if you were looking at Transcribus as a software used for historical documents, they presented some interesting challenges. So we uploaded these document scans, we corrected the layouts, and we tagged and incorporated the Tsuut'ina in English text, some of which had previously been transcribed in Word. And once we had done this for a notebook, about 108 pages, we trained an HTR model of Sapir's handwriting. So this model was trained on our first notebook and then was applied to the additional notebooks in the collection. And we found that the character error rate was approximately 17% when applied to unseen lines in these remaining notebooks, mostly with errors with accents or diacritics. And so what this means was about 17% of the time, if we took this handwritten text recognition model we had prepared and had added it to a new document written by Sapir, only about 17% of the time would we see an error. And generally speaking, when your character error rate is about 20%, a little bit less than 20%, it's typically faster to correct these automatically recognized texts than to transcribe kind of from scratch, to start at the beginning and upload everything manually. So if you look to this image we've provided on the left, if you look at line 136, you can see that's in a word for we. There's a slight error in the transcription there. I believe one of the letters is missing from the image above it. That includes the kind of base scan that we uploaded. But more or less, most of the words are correctly represented or faithfully represented. And so it's easier to correct those errors than to start over. Now, in using Transcribus for these projects, the Goddard notebooks, the OneSpot Superior notebooks, the OneSpot Young notebooks, we've found that there are some significant advantages and disadvantages to kind of using and incorporating this tool into our own workflow. Many advantages, like the non-proprietary formats or the open source and cloud-based services Transcribus offers, we've talked about earlier, but we wanted to really get at things that we felt were impactful and relevant to us while we were working with Transcribus. So one of these first main issues, and what we found to be a significant advantage with Transcribus, is this issue of data sovereignty. When you use Transcribus, all of your rights remain with the users, the people who upload those documents. So we can consent as users to share materials more widely, but by default, our collections are kept private. And while Transcribus can draw on users' collections, they only do so for the purposes of kind of internally improving their software and their services. So they're not going to take your data and use images or use portions of it for advertisement or their own purposes outside of just improving their software and their tools. And so for a lot of people, that can be a really important feature. In terms of the unique disadvantages we encountered, the first is that while Transcribus being a cloud-based program can be particularly advantageous, in many ways, if the remote server goes down, you can temporarily lose access to your documents. We encountered this on May 5th of 2020, when I believe I went to go start working and couldn't access any of my documents. But the good news is that you can always export full backups of your work, and reportedly you can annotate those offline copies as well. So if you have backups offline, then you can kind of navigate around that issue. We also found that a significant problem with Transcribus was this issue of training. It was kind of problematic that as new users coming into Transcribus, we didn't really know what to do or how to operate the expert client most effectively. And the interface in that desktop application is not necessarily intuitive. But we found that after approximately 10 hours of use, users became rapidly comfortable with performing what we consider to be regular tasks. So adding regions or lines or baselines and adjusting reading order, these kinds of everyday habitual tasks. So those came relatively quickly. And for users who are concerned about using Transcribus and practicing their skills, they can always prepare training documents where you upload just a page or so of your collection and then give users free rein to experiment with the tools that Transcribus offers on that page alone without impacting the rest of your collection. And in good news, Transcribus and additional online resources provide plenty of reference guides for users, but it should be noted that these are not necessarily made by linguists or documentary linguists for documentary linguists. So the advice or guidance given in these references may not always be applicable to what we are looking to do.
In conclusion, digital tools that facilitate the annotation of audiovisual recordings, such as ELAN and Xmerelda, have come to provide critical support for many aspects of current work in language documentation and conservation. We see similar promise in tools such as Transcribus, which extend annotation practices to still image language resources. Tools like Transcribus can help open handwritten language materials contents to a broader range of uses and facilitate the collaborative involvement of a wider community of contributors. However, as always, it's important to consider community priorities and specific contexts of use before applying tools like these. Where appropriate to use, tools such as Transcribus have the potential to make work with still image resources for Indigenous and minority languages much easier and to produce richer outputs. Thank you so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed our presentation. And if you're interested in learning more about Transcribus and familiarizing yourself with the interface, we have the slide of resources you can use. And just a quick look at our references here so you know where all of our information is coming from. Thank you so much again for listening.